Right, today we're going to examine part 2 of the miraculous life of the Buddha, that is SD 52.1, and I'll be talking based on section 1.0.2, a psychology of mythology. Now I have to warn you right at the start, this is quite a technical, quite a difficult talk. So in a sense, I'm trying to simplify this passage here. In fact, the introduction to this book is quite difficult reading. You can forego the whole section. If you are not inclined to such matters, you can straight away go to section 2 and 3, which are more interesting. Section 1 is more for the scholar, for those who are interested in the psychology of mythology. We have two big terms here, psychology and mythology. So here in my survey of the life of the Buddha, from his descent from Tusita, in other words his conception or his birth, if you like, before the birth rather, just before the birth, and to just before the spiritual birth, that is awakening. So that's about a period of 28 years, I think. So kind of more or less the period of a man reaching his maturity. So we have, first of all, psychology. So I've examined these stories of the Bodhisattva in terms of what sort of mind is he going through, and how does this kind of mind-based study of the life of the Buddha help us in our own practice, our own development, our own spiritual progress. And then there is mythology. Mythology are basically stories. In fact, I read somewhere that they are actually real stories. That is very interesting because I don't remember reading it as true stories. Well, I suppose someone could have written them as true stories for some reason. But they're not true in the sense of stories that happen in our daily life. We don't see gods walking the streets, things like that. The real stories in the sense that they are the realities that we face in life. So a myth reenacts, preserves such experiences in a narrative form, in an interesting way, in a kind of iconic way, if you like. Something we can tell and retell down the generations to the young. The language is symbolic and in a sense fanciful, imaginative. So this is something which will fascinate the young people for the simple reason they're willing to suspend their judgment. Of course, we would say the young are unable to make good judgment anyway. So the adults are kind of telling them these stories because they are judgment-free, and it's easy to tell such stories to them because they quite readily believe in such stories. But this is a very vital process in humanity. It is this kind of stories that make a human child human. Often enough, I've said that we are born human. Our parents gave us a human body, but they could stop there. If we were abducted by some gorilla or some wolf, female gorilla, female wolf, that instinctively kind of protect their young ones, and protect their babies. I saw one rather nice video on Facebook last week. There was this puppy, there was this dog that had like half a dozen little puppies. And here comes along this little baby, kind of unsteadily walking along, and he has this fancy for one of the puppies, and he takes the puppy along and away. And this mother dog runs after the baby and tries to seize the puppy back. You see this struggle going on, and the baby is about the height of the dog, and you see this very interesting struggle between human and dog. The mother wants her puppy back, so you can see this love, this well, we can call it love, although we do not know what the dog actually feels or thinks, but certainly a kind of sense that this is my baby in human language. So we can see the sense of feeling of a mother even in an animal. If a female gorilla, female wolf, it could be some other kind of animals too, were to chance upon a newborn baby and he or she rather takes care of this baby, during the first 7 years, this human with a human body, this being with a human body is going to end up becoming whomever has taken care of him, whether it's a wolf or it's a lion or it's a gorilla. So our parents gave us a human body, then our parents spend a few years, especially the first 7 years, telling us stories, hugging us, talking to us, and this is a process of humanizing. This is a second process which is vital for making us human. So mythology forms a very important part of our humanizing process. If we lack this, then of course there is religion. But religion is a kind of a biased way of telling stories, whereas mythology is more open. It belongs to basically everyone in that community. So when we talk about mythology, we're talking about, in a sense, the cultural memory, the psychological memory, collective memory of that culture. And often enough, such stories have such a universal appeal that even though it is originally the experience of a particular community or even race, now with knowledge easily available to anyone who seeks it in the internet or books and so on, they will connect themselves. They see the significance of these mythologies and stories that relate to them. And often enough, we can see some kind of mutual influences amongst the various cultures. Then what is even more interesting, we have this group of stories, mythologies, ancient stories, where we can theoretically say you have this group of stories by the Indo-Aryans. Some of them migrated down to India, and you have the story, like the stories of the Buddhist gods. And then you have this Greek mythology, Roman mythology, which is a rehash of Greek mythology. And then you have this Scandinavian mythology. So one reason is why these three groups that I mentioned are fascinating is because they are far apart. So they kind of have different experiences, so you find their stories also kind of reflect their own experiences. And of course there is a spectrum of other stories and legends in between. For example, in Britain you have the mythology of Arthur and the knights, and so on. So in Buddhist mythology, you have stories of the Buddha which are difficult to explain as ordinary stories. For example, we are told in Sunday school when the child Siddhartha was born, he is no ordinary birth. He was born from the mother's right side, and the mother was standing, holding onto the branch of this Soria robusta tree, and then she gave birth. And then this child, the feet doesn't touch the ground, doesn't touch the earth. Lotuses sprang forth to support his feet, and he could stand. And I mean, that's really amazing for a newborn child to be able to stand. And he's kind of born clean. There's no mucus or anything like that, and he's able to talk, and so on, things like that. So these are not normal things, right? So we have to explain why. What's the meaning of this? It's not a question of whether these things actually happen or not. The storytellers are trying to tell us this is no ordinary child, and he's going to teach something very special to us. Okay, so some people may think, oh yeah, all right, but how do we know he even existed? That's a very interesting question. We can assume in this mythical scenario that the Buddha whom we talk in this way does not exist in the way we exist. All right? But if we are to follow his teachings, if we are to carefully study and practice the teachings of the early Buddhist texts, the EBTs, or the suttas, you will see a kind of coherent flow of ideas and teachings, practices that are meaningful and effective, and that change our lives like no other system. Now that alone should make us question who is the author of such teachings. Of course, the Buddha did not write all these things down, but we know there are others, editors and memorizers and saintly monks who memorize these teachings. Even if you have a committee, it is very difficult to form such smoothly flowing, interconnected sets of teachings. So these editors and monk memorizers, the reciters, they must have remembered all these teachings from a common pool of teachings from a particular teacher, that is the Buddha. So we can imagine in that way that this is the teacher. And moreover, it's not really important whether we know this teacher existed or not, but because from the teaching we know there is this wonderful way that can make us just like this teacher that we fantasize about, if you like. So when we talk of psychology of mythology of such a person, we are talking both about the Buddha as a story, especially the first 28 years or so of his life, and we're also talking about the psychology of it all. What sort of mental process does he go through that made him, for example, to be shocked to see the three sides of an old man, a sick man, a dead man, for example. So this is a kind of a very high human drama, and he sees the fourth side, and he becomes a renunciant, and he leaves home. What makes him give up his worldly pleasures, worldly power, for the simple life of a wanderer seeking the truth? So, and this happens to him around his late 20s. And interestingly, this is also a time when most of us, the men that is, when we reach that period, late 20s and early 30s, we tend to question lots of things about our life. What am I doing? I want to do something meaningful for myself, or maybe for the world, and so on. We have this grand vision, something bigger than us. So this is an event that occurs around that period. So you can see it's not just stories, but there's also this kind of working of the mind. So when we look at the stories of the myths of the Buddha, we're also looking into our own minds. That is why I call it a psychology of mythology. Right? Let me now quickly just go through this. Some of these items are written here. What is a myth? We can kind of examine it in 3 ways and 2 aspects. Number 1, a myth uses symbolic language, so it's not ordinary language, right? When we say the Buddha walked 7 steps, the devas were there protecting him, and so on. This is all symbolic language. What do they symbolize? And then he says something, symbolic language again. And so this study talks about all that in detail. In other words, here we have this child who's going to be the man. He declares, he's going to declare the highest truth. So we are given that idea. Here is this child who's going to do that. And when he does teach, he uses figurative language. In other words, comparisons, analogies, similes, parables. He uses stories. Stories means you relate something that is real, that happens to everyone, but without mentioning their name, so to speak. We just say, imagine someone else doing this. Then the listener will say, oh, that looks like me, that sounds like me, and they begin to relate without embarrassment, without fear, and they say, oh dear, this is what will happen if I do this, or I should do this, and this is the good that will happen. So it's a chance for them to examine possibilities before they actually do it. In that way, they wouldn't get themselves into trouble, they have a better choice and a happier life as a result. So, and also the Buddha sometimes used something really amazing, which is called, in our times, intentional language. This is sometimes called the language of cognitive shift. For example, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says things like, kill your father, kill your mother. And that sounds shocking in ordinary daily language. But then he says, oh, mother means craving, father means ignorance, something like that. So you have this new meaning to this. So it is dramatized, right? Of course, the Zen people take it to quite absurd extremes and say, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him, okay? And some people who love violence, I suppose, secretly love violence, they think, wow, this is a great statement, you can kill the Buddha, So, well, but there is this idea of a shift in our cognition from that. I mean, if you meet the Buddha on the road, it's obviously not the real Buddha. He's gone. I mean, he's awakened. It's just someone pretending to be Buddha. So you should destroy that idea, let go of that idea that there is this Buddha out there. And that's the story. Now that's the meaning, that's the myth. Now the sad contradiction is this. We still look up to Zen masters and gurus as Buddhas, so that's the irony of it. People make statements, but they forget it after that. And so this is where there's a danger there. So the stories and the myths need to be told again and again on different levels, different ways. That is why the suttas are so vital to us. when we get lost in the language of figures and myths and cognitive shifts, we may forget the ordinary daily language. So the suttas bring us back to ground zero, if you like. Say, hey, this is what it really is. You've got to come back to reality. So the early Buddhist suttas are vital in bringing us back to this ground zero, to this ground reality of daily life. Before we get lost, we say great things, but we forget it and we do just exactly the opposite of what we have taught. That's religion, unfortunately. So the Dhamma is not religion. The Dhamma frees us from religion, frees us from rituals, frees us from views, frees us from identifying with a group or with ourselves even. If you can do that, then you attain the first stage of the path called stream winning. Now the next point too is the myth is a descriptive or objective means for communicating or expressing in form or content. In other words, generally or superficially, the mythical elements of the Bodhisattva's life. And that is the form aspect. Then the content of particular elements, particular stories in his life. Okay, form, in other words, is general idea. Then the content is for example, the story of the child taking 7 steps and so on. Okay, so these are just technical details. If you find them a bit difficult to follow, you can just forget about them. They're more for the scholars to kind of debate on. Now the third quality here is the myth is a natural narrative of something primitive, something pre-scientific, in other words. It's not something you can prove or measure. We talk about the universe and the world, but it's not the kind of universe that the scientists, cosmologists talk about. We talk about the heavens of the 33 and so on, and the gods kind of come down and mingle with the people. It doesn't matter whether you believe these heavens are real or not. Believe if you like, not believe if you don't like. Don't argue about them. Hold all these ideas as provisional. I mean, just like story of Jack and the Beanstalk, whether you believe in it or not, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is whether these stories change your life for the better, whether these stories remind you to be diligent, to be inventive, to not to give up in face of any kind of difficulties, even meeting giants. So that's more important than arguing, that such stories are true or false. So it is natural in the sense that they relate to our natural, normal human behavior. They cannot be proven, but they are there. They reflect our daily emotions, our reactions to situations, how we relate to one another, and so on. Number 4, we are talking about the Buddha here. So we know the word Buddha, but we do not know who really the Buddha is. It's impossible to know him at our current state, our current level. So we use stories to try to understand these different aspects of him. What kind of person he is, and how we can emulate him. In other words, how we can have a glimpse into the inner experience of the Buddha. So this is another way we can look at the myth of the Buddha. And number 5, the last one, is demythologization. Now this is a big word meaning different things to different religions. demythologize. That means to make it not a myth. Try to draw out the meaning, clarify some kind of eternal truth behind these stories, if possible. To show something that is expressed culturally, historically, or temporally, to see that kind of connection. What is the point of religious language? What's the point of all these stories, in other words? So, when we talk about, for example, the Buddha belongs to the lineage of the sun. He is called Aditya Bandhu, he is called kinsman of the sun. What does that mean? It's not important that whether he is or is not part of a lineage that goes back to the very first family that arose in the world. We don't know that. There's no way of proving it. It's a very beautiful story. But to call the Buddha kinsman of the sun means for us that he has something to do with light and life. That's the sun. Okay? When we understand something, we have this new life. When we understand the Dhamma, we have this new life. And our life brightens up with loving kindness and so on. So in that sense, the Buddha is like the sun who is the source of all this light and life for us. So that's one way, a very simple way. We understand that the Buddha is the kinsman of the sun. And the Buddha calls the monks sometimes as his children. Again, here, we're not saying he's married. He really biologically he gave birth to all these monks. They are born of his breast, of the heart, from the teaching, from the Dhamma. And the nuns are the daughters in spirit and so on. So this is a very beautiful way of showing just as a child is born of the mother, so are you born of the Dharma because you listen to the Dhamma I've taught you. And Mahapajapati Gotami, before she passes away, gave a very beautiful, kind of recited some beautiful poems about this. She said something like, the Buddha, now I'm this Sakyamuni's mother, but he is my father. You see, there's a contradiction there. Because we're talking about different levels of understanding. When Pajapati says, I am Sakyamuni's mother, of course she's talking about being a nursing this child after the passing away of Queen Maya, as a biological parent, more or less. But when he says that Sakyamuni is my father, she's talking about her new birth, her awakening as an arhat. So you see, similar words used in different ways. So this is the typical quality of myths and legends too. So to demythologize is, in other words, to take a step back and remind ourselves, okay, what does all this mean? Okay? That's one meaning. You see this demythologization also at the start of the Sigalovada Sutta, right? Where the Buddha meets this young Sigala who is praying to the six directions because that was his late father's last instructions. Then the Buddha says, okay, but this is not the way the noble ones worship or protect the six directions. Then he demythologizes these six directions of religion into the six kinds of reciprocal duties, social duties. So there's a wonderful classic example of demythologization, which you can study in the Sigalovada Sutta. Okay? So the last one, number 6, in the miraculous life of the Buddha, you see the mental aspect and the cultural aspect combined and how they relate to our life. Okay? So that brings to the end of all what I have to say for today. So you can see it's quite fascinating to really know about mythology. I suppose you might say, oh, it's much easier, it's more fun listening than reading. Well, but sometimes reading gives you time to stop and think and then kind of relate to what you've heard. Okay, right, so do read up the introduction here if you feel like it. If not, go straight into the stories of ST 52.1 to know more about the Buddha before he became Buddha. Just spend a quiet moment recalling the significance of this, what you have heard. We have the story of the Buddha before us, one of the most beautiful and significant stories that shapes us as humans and allow us to transcend our humanity to divinity and beyond. And this alone is wonderful, it's amazing in itself. And the Buddha has given us all this. Reflecting in this way is wonderful good karma. With the power of such karma, may we be blessed with wisdom, compassion, and above all, the courage to aspire to stream winning in this life itself. And by the power of all this goodness, may we be well, may we be happy, meantime to do the Dhamma work, study, practice, realize, or at least to teach the Dhamma to others. And may all our loved ones to be well and happy. May those who are practicing the Dhamma rightly to taste the fruit of their practice in this life itself. And may those who are lost, teaching the wrong things, having difficulties with the Dhamma, see the true path, the true teaching in this life itself. May all beings be well and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.